Hello, welcome to another episode of Forgotten Cemeteries, Pacific Northwest. Today we're in the magical, secluded Gales Creek area, specifically at Gales Creek Cemetery, and we have a good one today. A lot of cool stories here. Located in Gales Creek, Oregon, Washington County. Alternative names of the cemetery include Gales Creek Union and just plain old Pioneer. So let's go meet some of the local residents and hear their story. Welcome to a very cold morning, by the way, as well. It's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. There's frost everywhere all over the tombstone, and yeah, hopefully I'll battle through this. So we have an establishment date in 1874 with 100 to 500 burials per the Oregon Burial Site Guide. Pioneer grave is showing 664 memorials, to give you an idea, so it grew a little bit since that site guide mentioned. Not a whole lot of anything history-wise about the cemetery. Even though the establishment date is 1874, the first burial in the cemetery was 1872 of a woman named Nancy Sutton McCoy. As far as the town of Gales Creek is mentioned, it's very quiet in my history books, maybe like one or two sentences for the most part. From what I've read, the town was the last stagecoach stop on the way to the cheese capital of the Pacific Northwest, Tillamook. What is that noise? There's some animal off in the distance. See my Hill Cemetery vid if you'd like to hear all about the father of cheese in Tillamook. Cool story. The town of Gales Creek gets its name, though, from a famous trapper named Joseph Gale. This guy was pretty famous during the early days of Oregon, hanging out with our whiskey distillery loving friend Ewing Young. But Joseph was part of Ewing's crew hunting beaver and sea otter in California. Oh. They were planning on traveling back to the Rocky Mountains, but I guess Joseph decided to stay with Ewing and a man named Paul J. Kelly, a New England man well known for his advocacy for settlement in Oregon. They traveled to Oregon and allegedly introduced the first cattle to the state. So next time you Oregonians are buying Oregon grass-fed beef, you can probably thank these guys. I couldn't really piece it together, but at some point, Paul J. Kelly and his party were ordered to leave the Oregon Territory by the Hudson Bay Company chief factor John McLaughlin, a very powerful individual in the Pacific Northwest area back then. Not sure why, but he just maybe didn't want competition or just seeker to get out in the Pacific Northwest. However, Kelly would be remembered for his time in Oregon, as you can visit Kelly Point Park in North Portland, a popular site where men and women apparently propose to their partner, so that's cool. Back to our friend Joseph Gale. He would marry a woman in 1835 named Eliza Gale, who was Nez Pierce, and her true name was possibly Bear Claws. Joseph would be chosen as one of the three men for the first executive committee of the Oregon Provisional Government. A note mentioned this would make him one of Oregon's first governors. One of the issues he dealt with was Oregon was kind of blowing up during this time population-wise. Livestock was very low in numbers, so I guess he ordered to build a ship known as the Star of Order, which Joseph Gale actually helped build himself with a crew. They would travel to California and pick up livestock, and he was offered to be the captain of that boat during the time. Years after that, Joseph and his family settled in Gales Creek in 1844. However, Joseph would make his move his family eastward Oregon at one point and die on his farm in 1881. He is buried at something called Eagle Valley Cemetery in Baker County, Oregon. His wife would move to Umatilla Indian Reservation, hope I'm saying that right, and would be buried at Weston Cemetery. So, if you're a Civil War fan, this is a cemetery for you, with Union soldiers and heavy on actually the Confederate Army vets, surprisingly. For the sake of time, we'll select a few headstones. We'll get to meet a Confederate who served under the Witchers Battalion, a no mercy group. I mean, these guys put Cobra Kai to shame. We'll hear a story on why you should never come between a farmer and his horse, and how it changed the outcome of an entire Civil War battle, and our favorite, tragedy along the Oregon Trail. In my research, I noticed the cemetery has West Virginia roots, heavy on that for the most part, so if you're from West Virginia, I think you'll enjoy this vid. And here's James P. Lilly, Confederate soldier, serving in Company E of the 151st Regiment of Virginia Militia Infantry, and also serving in Company B of the 23rd Battalion Virginia Infantry. Someone was nice enough to post his pic on Find a Grave. Couldn't find much info on the 151st, but that 2nd Battalion, the 23rd, mainly fought with the Army of Northern Virginia. They were the main military force for the CSA and the Eastern Theater, and were commanded by a few guys, more notably Robert E. Lee. But the 23rd was involved in several key battles during the Civil War, and one of them I don't think we've talked about, and that would be the Battle of Cheat Mountain. This would actually be the first battle in which Robert E. Lee led troops. Sheep Mountain is located in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia, and the Union Army had a garrison, Fort Milroy, located at Cheat Summit, the highest point Union camp during the Civil War. From what I read, it wasn't like the Confederates that caused the Union to finally abandon Fort Milroy, but Mother Nature. Construction of the garrison started in July of 1861. By September, horses were freezing to death, and Union forces were successful in driving out the Confederates. In April of 1862, Union forces moved out of the area and seemed happy to leave Cheat Summit. I think they were pretty much done with it. Apparently, there's a Fort Milroy cemetery, but bodies were exhumed at one point and moved to West Virginia National Cemetery. However, if we have any West Virginia viewers out there, rumor has it you can still observe the grave depressions until this day at the original location of Fort Milroy. And on a positive note, for all the zoology fans out there, the Cheat Mountain salamander was discovered in 1935 and is only found at Cheat Mountains. So a little bit of animal tidbit there. And just a row over is Robert Preston Lilly, would be brother of James we just talked about, and another Confederate Civil War vet, serving in Company E of the 151st Virginia Militia Infantry Regiment, and later in Company B of the 23rd Battalion, Virginia Infantry. Hopefully you guys can see that. It always looks weird to me, but then I watch it later and it looks kind of crystal clear. But this would be the headstone of Albert Sargent. Born in 1840 in Ontario, Canada, and came to New York in the 1860s. He is a Civil War vet, joining up with Company L of the 15th New York Engineers, nicknamed the New York Sappers and Miners. There is a monument I found located in Gettysburg that is dedicated to New York's 2 engineering units, the only volunteer engineering units of the Army of the Potomac. Looking them up, they did see action in the Battle of Fredericksburg, Wilderness, Gettysburg, obviously, and much more. Post-Civil War, Albert would move his family out to Holton, Kansas, and in 1886 married Elizabeth Walter. Late arrival into Oregon about 1893, but a source referred to the Sargent families as one of the first to settle in the Gales Creek area, actually. They would run a wagon station and a post office in the area. Sadly, I cannot find the marker for a Green Meader Sweeney, I think is how he says his name. Probably the headstone that has the most deep history in this cemetery by far. But I'll put a little picture of his grave marker. But he was born in Flat Top, West Virginia. You wouldn't know it based on the grave marker, but Green served in Company K of the 34th Battalion of the Virginia Cavalry. Very brutal one as well. And we're about to talk about the origins of this battalion. When I researched him, I did indeed find he served under the Confederacy and started off as a private and was eventually promoted to sergeant, and also listed as a prisoner of war. The 34th was known as the Witcher's Battalion, Virginia Mounted Cavalry. They saw action in Piedmont, were involved with operations in East Tennessee and Gettysburg. The 34th was led by a man named Vincent Addison Witcher, aka the Clawhammer was his nickname. 3 words to describe this guy. Fearless, ruthless, and barbaric. No mercy. At Gettysburg, he often bragged about how he took 432 men in the battle and lost all but 96. So the guy was not afraid to go up into the worst of situations, even though he was like gonna pretty much wipe his army and die, I guess. I guess they called him the Clawhammer because of a particular black style coat he wore in the battle, a swallowtail. It had sort of like a scissors design looking, kind of like a clawhammer, which was odd given swallowtails were like formal wear. I guess they were like for dinner parties and such. So let's talk about the Witcher's reign of terror before the Civil War. I thought our last visit to L'Oreal and coming across Champ Ferguson was one of the more brutal individuals we encountered during our journey. Wait till you hear about this Witcher guy. I could do a whole video on him, but for the sake of time, let's begin with Confederate guerrilla warfare. So during the beginning of the Civil War, the citizens of the mountainous region of Kentucky and Virginia didn't really fit in with the Confederates or Union. They kind of said like, both kind of suck. At this time, Clawhammer Witcher lived in Wayne County, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. And at this time, Clawhammer gathered some pro-Confederate men to lead. Thus, the Witcher boys were born. This area had pro-Union supporters, and that wasn't really flying with the Witcher boys at the time. And eliminate them they did. And not just shoot them and move on. There's a particular method the Witcher boys like to use, and viewer discretion is advised. I guess it would be audible discretion. Basically what they did was they would lynch you and tie a rope to a sapling, and then like crank it back really far and release it over and over and over, and your neck would basically like tear apart slowly, and eventually your head would pop off. So pretty brutal way to execute someone very slowly. To give you an idea, their execution tactics were so brutal that one man could only be identified by the underwear his wife made him. I guess she put his name in the underwear. Reading up on Vincent, he was a big fan of beating a man until their brains came out. That was one of his favorite methods. So these guys did not show any mercy. They were like a twisted version of Cobra Kai. They would be identified by the federal and Confederate government, thus the 34th Battalion was created. And as mentioned, they saw some battles. Gettysburg being the big one for them, and eventually our luck runs out, doesn't it? Clawhammer would run into a man named George Armstrong Custer, who surprisingly finished at the bottom of his West Point class, but was highly effective in the Battle of Gettysburg, actually. As mentioned, 96 out of the 432 men Clawhammer led in the battles in Gettysburg would remain after fighting, so he lost quite a bit of his crew. Fast forward a bit, General Lee would surrender, and Clawhammer would move to Utah after the war to become a lawyer, and is quoted as saying, "To get away from those damn Yankees." Good band, by the way. He also was quoted as saying, "For many years, I have been dissatisfied with both the centralized tendency of the Republicans and the insincerity of the Democrats, who seem to have no great underlying principles." End of quote. So imagine that, being split on U.S. politics. But our boy, Green, buried at the cemetery, seemed to be some mentor of some sorts to the younger people, and not sure when he came to Oregon, but he did live until the age of 71. Here's John Thomas Fletcher, born in 1840 in Sangamon County, Illinois. His headstone says 1841 now that I mentioned it. Maybe find a grave has a little typo, but appears to have a deep family history going back to Massachusetts. It was briefly mentioned, and unsure why, one of John's arms was like unusable, so labor wasn't an option for him, so he went into teaching. Unsure when he exactly came to Oregon, but his teaching would come in handy as he was hired along the Oregon Trail to teach the kids. But he would gain teaching employment in Oregon, landing in Buena Vista, Oregon. Sounds something fancy, like a Florida name. In 1866, he married a woman named Edna Catherine Kimes, who we'll visit in a little bit here. She's a pioneer of 1853 and had a tragic family loss along the journey. Pretty rough trip for her. Both would move to the Gales Creek area, where John would be hired on as a wagon driver and a teacher. And here is John's wife, Edna Catherine Kimes Fletcher, born in DeKalb County, oh boy, Missouri. That's not right. Considered the northern edge of the Bible Belt. In 1853, her family decided to make the big move to Oregon. During their travels, they encountered the Missouri River, as if wagon accidents weren't freaking enough, and lovely diseases. Many people lost their lives to drowning during the big migration. May 5th, 1853, Edna's father, Lewis Ray Kimes, at the age of 31, was helping wagons cross the Missouri River. Unfortunately, Lewis would fall victim and drown that day, leaving his pregnant wife Nancy and Edna and her older sister and brother Ray. Edna and her family basically had to wait for help as they needed someone to drive the wagons. Along comes two men named Robert and Henry Pittock. And if you're an Oregonian, you've definitely heard that last name. More specifically, Henry Louis Pittock, who basically built an empire in the state, taking over the Oregonian newspaper, having real estate, banking, railroad, and steamboat investments, silver mining operations, and entries into the paper and pulp industry. So pretty powerful family. For those out of state or overseas, there's a famous mansion in Portland called Pittock Mansion. And if you visit Portland, I highly recommend visiting it. You'll feel like you're kind of back in time, and it's a pretty cool experience seeing all the plumbing and such. Back to Edna, they would eventually end up in Oregon and head out to our favorite area, Yamhill, as their uncle Hiram helped them out, giving them farmland. Coincidentally, the exact location of this farm is a future cemetery visit, Pike Cemetery. But I believe it used to be called Buckingham Cemetery, but more confusingly, it's Pike Cemetery and North Yamhill Cemetery. So, I don't know. We'll figure it out when the time comes. And here's the fancy, clean headstone of Private Augustine Mitchell Carpenter. Born in 1820 in Oswego County, New York, served in the 4th Light Artillery of Wisconsin, saw a few battles such as Drury's Bluff, held in Chesterfield County, Virginia, the Siege of Petersburg, which we talked about, the siege mortar named the Dictator at Sunset Cemetery video, if you're interested in that story, and also the Battle of Seven Pines. Battle of Seven Pines would lead to the appointment of Robert E. Lee as commander, because Commander Joseph E. Johnson would be severely wounded during that battle. And just a quick stop at Joseph Lee's headstone, who was born in 1841, and from what I gathered, a pioneer of 1847, so very early arrival into Oregon. There is a memorial at Pacific University called the Pioneer Graveyard with only 4 names listed. 2 of them was of Joseph's father and mother, Philemon Lee and Elizabeth Johnson Lee. Oh, finally the sun came out. Okay, here we have James Martin, obviously a Civil War vet. If you watch this channel, you're getting familiar with that style headstone there. Company A of the 12th Kansas Militia. Looking them up, they served in the Battle of Byram's Ford and what was classified as the Gettysburg of the West, the Battle of Westport. And let's learn why you should never come across a farmer and his horse. There was a farmer named George Tumin who came to America in 1856 and settled along the Big Blue River. I tried to put up a little old map for you guys to give you an idea. Look for Brush Creek all the way to the left. He was noticing the rising tensions at Kansas-Missouri border. This caused him to move him and his family into a friend's house in 1864 to Westport. Unsure if it was voluntary because we talked about Order 11 during our visit to Robert Byrd Cemetery, if you'd like to learn about that order. It was basically an order to force any potential Confederate supporting residents out of the countryside to western Missouri. Even if you were aligned with the Union, they said move along. They just did not care. They wanted you out of the area. In Lucky George, massive Union and Confederate forces were building up in this area. Coincidentally, Westport served as a launch point for people headed to Oregon. So this is becoming kind of like a hotspot, as it was inevitable that there would be a big battle to break out. October 22nd, 1864, Confederate Major Sterling Price was in the area, and during this time, an article described his actions as kind of like a looting expeditions, if anything. Unfortunately, our farmer friend George Tumin would fall victim to Price's soldiers as they would loot his home at night, stealing food and tableware. More importantly, the soldiers wanted his gray mare. Tumin would put up resistance as he stated the mare was pregnant, but the Confederate soldiers obviously didn't care and took it. They didn't think much of it because, you know, who was this guy? He was a simple farmer, and what the hell could he honestly do about it? Well, we're about to find out why looting this simple farmer would be a critical mistake. So the Confederate Army formed a very strong defensive position on a rock hill in Brush Creek area overlooking the meadow where the Union troops were advancing. And attacks were pretty much unsuccessful at this point. They just failed over and over. Union Major General Samuel Ryan Curtis during this time was looking for basically any alternatives to press the Confederates because head-on just wasn't working. Story goes that our farmer friend George Tumin, who apparently was searching for his horse, was like roaming the battlefield. There's bullets flying everywhere and explosions. He was pretty determined to reclaim his mare. No fear. Curtis's scouts talked to him, and it turns out Tumin knew of a stream a few hundred yards to the west that flowed into Brush Creek, more specifically utilizing Swan Creek to advance on the Confederates. It would allow the Union forces to get behind the Confederate forces undetected. More importantly, it forced both armies into full view into an open prairie. From there, it was pretty much a disaster for the Confederate armies as they couldn't hold out any longer. They were basically overwhelmed by Union forces, and a retreat was ordered. The Battle of Westport was one of the largest battles west of the Mississippi River and was a Union victory, killing off Sterling Price's Missouri campaign. 30,000 soldiers fought in this battle. A great story and a victory for the Union, but sadly, there's no information or historical records available for our farmer friend George if he ever reconnected with his gray mare. I could only find one George Tumin buried in Missouri on Find a Grave, and I'm just unsure if it's him, but a pretty epic story of turning the tide of a battle. One of the stranger finds we've seen here, it appears William A. Britton's headstone is either sinking into the earth or maybe it broke in half and someone just set it there, but it's like being engulfed by the cemetery earth. William A. Britton was a soldier of the Company G of the 4th Tennessee Infantry, so that would make him another Civil War veteran in this cemetery. William's company specifically was known as the Lauderdale Invincibles, and so they saw quite a bit of fighting action and served in the famous bloody engagement, the Battle of Shiloh. Time for the tour. There is kind of parking. It's like side of the road type of deal, and everyone slows down to stare at you, wondering what you're doing out here in the middle of nowhere, because It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's very quiet. Probably one of the more quieter cemeteries I visited. I think I hear running water over there in the distance. There is a lot of war vets here, I'd say. This one from Vietnam. Oh, just died recently, last year. That's cool. We've seen that before with the car. Sadly, didn't find Green Sweeney's headstone, but we had a nice little view of the cemetery. He told his story, where he came from, and the Witchers Battalion. They were pretty brutal, huh? Yeah, it's a little frosty this morning over here. It's a nice view, very quiet. Visit, there's a nice little area over here. Some like little decorations, some wind chimes. World's smallest birdhouse, I guess you could say. Sorry about the sun, but this little park bench. And we come back in the spring or summer and it's much warmer, not 30 degrees. Actually, there's a lot of park benches in here. Myers, Fireman. He's only 39. He died. And I think this is the only headstone in the whole cemetery with a Masonic. I could be mistaken, though. I am seeing the Grand Army of the Republic little plaque frequently in this cemetery. Like I said, pretty heavy on the war vets. Lafferty, that sounds like an important name. I feel like I've seen that before. As far as vandalism, I think it is slightly present here. Here's the biggest one I saw in the cemetery, and sadly appears to be a war vet that was hit. But not too bad on the vandalism. Compared to the other cemeteries we've seen, this one's in pretty good shape. Even though it says 500 burials in that Oregon burial site guide, it doesn't feel like it. It feels smaller than it is. There's Britons headstone. I don't know if it's just getting swallowed, maybe just kind of like a slope down, maybe the earth comes down slowly and buries it during heavy rains or something. Well, there is two pretty headstones coming up. First one is of John Wilson, born in Indiana, pioneer of 1852. So there's an early arrival. And the second headstone that kind of sticks out is of a Clearwaters. I feel like that last name's pretty heavy into history, huh? But very pretty with the floral arrangement on top. Must have been important. There are some hand-drawn ones. Here's Clady was only 9. All the lilies are. Lily is a big family in the cemetery. And the Cox family. A lot of pretty symbolism on their headstones. It's good to see there's not any vandalism with theirs. That one says "Gone Home." I don't know if we've seen that yet. Sorry for my sniffling. It's so cold. It's pretty with the seashells. I don't know why I'm so cold. I think it's because I live in Oregon now. When I grew up in Ohio, where I would get down in the negative range. So you think I would be battle hardened, but I think I've lost it. Well, this must be very old. Maybe not. It's kind of surrounded by the forest. Like I said, this one's out in the country. I wonder if these are old bases from headstones discarded. Yeah, they look like curb parts or something. Like I said, way out in the middle of nowhere. I wouldn't call it the middle of nowhere, but it feels like it when you're by yourself. Very peaceful. There's that greenish style headstone we've seen. It's kind of an old school one. I always liked it. And they always seem to stay like in really good shape as well. There is one lonely unmarked headstone over here by itself, way away from everybody. And as you can see, there's nothing over here that I know of. A bunch of four-wheeler marks, but yeah, it's odd. We'll go visit over here by the tree. Don't know who it is. Maybe something's on Find a Grave, but it does have one of those little solar lights on it. Whoever it is, the whole tree to themselves, with a very beautiful view of Gales Creek. So hope you guys enjoyed this one. And a few little cool stories, heavy on the Confederate Army history, which I did not expect at this one. If you have any other recommendations for cemeteries to visit in Oregon or Washington, feel free to comment below. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hope you enjoyed hearing the story of the Witchers Battalion. What a brutal force during the Civil War. Anyways, stay safe out there. Hope you enjoyed the video, and have a good one.